Joining me is David Kaye. He's a professor of law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law, also a former lawyer with the U.S. Department of State, responsible for the application of the Geneva Conventions and other areas of international law. David, really great to have you here. My first thought was to
Thanks.
do a segment based on some emails I had gotten about, 10 years after the Iraq War. Are statutes of limitations going to become a factor in thinking about possible war crimes charges against Bush administration officials? I'll put that question kind of on the back burner for now and first ask you about, if we are to talk about possible war crimes charges, what specifically would they be? In other words, when we get to the nitty gritty, what types of things conceivably could Bush administration officials be charged with?
Sure. And thanks for having me, David. I'm happy to be here. There are a range of different claims that have been made against Bush administration officials over the years. And, it's complicated by a number of factors, including whether we go back to the very beginning of the post 9/11 period and ask whether we're actually in an armed conflict. There are quite a number of people out there who believe that we're not in an armed conflict. And in that case, war crimes simply do not apply. You can only commit a war crime in time of war. So there is a divide out there between those who believe we're in an armed conflict or not. But let's assume that we're in an armed conflict, and that is really the bipartisan belief in Washington, I believe. If we're in an armed conflict, then a number of different kinds of war crimes charges could be leveled or alleged against members of the Bush administration, whether we're talking about military or other agencies such as the CIA. And I think the one that we heard most about over the last 10 years has been related to torture. Torture is a war crime. It's a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. It's a crime under the Convention Against Torture. And that's one area where there's significant information suggesting that torture was committed by U.S. officials, by U.S. contractors, was authorized by U.S. officials over the course of particularly the first several years after 9/11. And I think that would be the one that would probably would be at the highest profile, I would say. But of course, there are other kinds of war crimes that might be alleged. Those might have to do with death that resulted from poor treatment, from maltreatment at different sites that were run by U.S. officials, and so those kinds of allegations would amount to murder as a war crime. I want to just emphasize that even if we're not talking about war crimes, I mean, war crimes is in a way shorthand for bad acts that took place in the post 9/11 environment. War crimes are not the exclusive way of thinking about these. There's domestic law against torture under the Convention Against Torture and the Torture Victim Protection Act. There's obviously murder charges that can be brought under U.S. law, basic kind of federal tort kinds of issues.
Sure.
There's all sorts of allegations out there that could be lodged against U.S. officials, even before we get to the questions, as you suggested, about whether it's plausible to even think about
Right.
these kinds of prosecutions or claims being brought.
So before we get into that, separate from the torture questions, as we get more and more information from individuals that were involved with the intelligence that was used or lack of intelligence that was used to get us into the war with Iraq, we find out that there was a deliberate effort to manipulate that intelligence to give a particular idea. And among those things are, for example, the claim that Saddam Hussein had and could have deployed weapons of mass destruction within a 45-minute window. Given that we know that that was a deliberate manipulation of intelligence to show something that was not true, is there anything along those lines that anybody could be charged with?
And that's a really good question. I wouldn't consider that under the umbrella of war crimes or crimes against humanity. And it'd be very, very difficult to identify any specific area of law where criminal charges could be brought for the actual resort to force in Iraq. And, there is, an emerging, I wouldn't say even consensus, but there's an emerging trend in international law to deal with the crime of aggression, which is separate from war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide, which are subject matter jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. One might consider aggression, which was prosecuted in Nuremberg, for example, to be another heading for prosecutions. But I find that, first of all, it's not something that will happen in the context of Iraq, particularly in the ICC, where there is no jurisdiction. But also because we don't have any firm rule of law in the United States that would govern that kind of prosecution. So that's sort of a long way of saying I don't see a mechanism for prosecution under the actual use of force, even if, as you mentioned, there are claims that we went into that conflict under false pretenses.
So let's touch on the statutes of limitation thing to kind of just get your thought on that. Is it true that as we have reached and passed the 10-year mark from the start of the Iraq War, is that significant in any way when it comes to the timing of possible war crimes, as hypothetical as they may be? What is the reality of statutes of limitations when it comes to these types of allegations?
Yeah, it's a good question. So first, there's the law that exists on the books. And, generally speaking, there's a statute of limitations that applies to claims under federal law. Typically, it's 5 years. In the case of torture, it's 8 years. I wouldn't count it from the moment of, the invasion of Iraq.
Right. It would be from when those acts happened, right?
Exactly. So, for whether we're talking about a prosecutor who might be investigating such claims or an individual claimant who might be making claims under civil jurisdiction, right, a claim for as a tort, essentially, you would go and count that from the time at which the injury occurred, at the time of the bad treatment. And so, it's hard to determine when that might be. But regardless, if we're looking at torture and we're talking about an 8-year statute of limitations, we're either very close or beyond the period where there could be prosecutions or claims brought against individuals for that kind of treatment. That's the law on the books.
We've been speaking with David Kaye. He's a professor of law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law, also a former lawyer with the U.S. Department of State. David, really great to have you on today. Thanks for your insights.
Yeah, my pleasure.